And I'm delighted that we now have and move to the second plenary session. And we are joined by Adrian Dottridge, the Director of People Transformation in the Ministry of Defence, and Brigadier Hugh Robertson, who is the recently appointed Implementation Team Head for the Reserve Forces 30 programme. Now, the focus of this plenary session is to explore the MOD thinking behind Reserve Force 2030, known as RF30, and the implications it has for how employers and the MOD will work together as the UK seeks greater resilience in a strategic context that is increasingly complex, dynamic, and competitive. Adrian, over to you.
Jacko, thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. My name's Adrian Dottridge. I'm Director of People Transformation here at the MOD and the SRO, Senior Responsible Officer for the implementation of Reserves Forces 30. And I'm joined today by my Head of Implementation, Brigadier Hugh, who has a long and esteemed career as an Army reservist. And we'll both expand a bit more shortly about who we are and our backgrounds and why it's us that are talking to you today. But before that, I do want to say very much it's a pleasure to be here. For those of you that were here for Jacko's remarks at the very start, I'll let you judge afterwards whether I was a piece of protein or merely carbohydrate. But either way, I wish I was with you face to face in person. And I hope that I'll be able to meet as many of you as possible as soon as circumstances allow. So, as Jacko said, we're here to talk to you about the emerging programme for the implementation of RF30, and we look forward to answering questions that you may have in the panel discussion coming shortly. I think it's important to say at the outset that in another universe, perhaps the one originally planned for when this date was put into diaries, we would have been able to provide you with quite a lot of detail on the contents of the report for the review, which would have been published by now, and you would have had the chance to read through the review report and be ready and poised to ask us lots of detailed questions based on that report. However, as you can tell, that's not the world we're living in quite yet. And so that's caused Hugh and I to pause and reflect on how we could best use this session. So today we can't tell you the detail of what's in the report for the review, with regret, but we can tell you something about the approach that the review has taken, the general areas it's been considering, and that will hopefully be enough to help seed our panel discussion later on. Can I have the next slide, please? And the next one after that. Thank you very much. So, I mean, working backwards, before you go to how and who and what, I think does come why. So why did Defence initiate an independent review in the first place? And I think the first thing to say is that RF30 very much builds on Future Reserves 20. And just, a note on the terminology here, and Defence certainly loves its acronyms. So we're moving from FR20 to RF30. I hope that doesn't cause too much confusion. And many of you, I assume, will have had at least some awareness of Future Reserves 20. And its aims are really to stabilise the reserves and to halt the decline in numbers that we'd seen over some of the preceding decades and build the reserves back up. Interestingly, that's where I had my very first experience of defence some five, 6 years ago, when I spent a week in Andover as an external gateway reviewer for Army 2020. And I heard and scrutinised firsthand the plans that the Army were putting in place then for the reserves at that point. I think the second thing to say is, there's very much a golden thread for RF30, which takes as its starting point some of the comments already being made in the videos by James Swift about how the nature of the threats that we face has inevitably shifted again, and this changes the capabilities that we will need and the skills needed to deliver those capabilities, and in what combination in order to counter those threats. And central to the thinking of the review has been the integrated operating concept. I probably can't undersell how important that is as a foundation stone for much of the work that's been done. And the short answer to why RF30 can be found within the integrated operating concept that CDS spoke to, Nick Carter spoke to Rusi about last autumn. And we've put a couple of quotes there, just a couple from IOPC on the slide there that I'll let you read through in your own time. And the key deduction from all that is that the roles for all parts of our whole force will need to continue to evolve, and the role of the reservists within that, within our force structure, will need to obviously evolve also. Now, it's worth me saying, quite pleasingly, that RF30 and the review has synchronized really quite well with our defence people strategy that we've been working to internally in the mod for some time now. And we've been thinking about many of the same things, of course, looking at those same strategic drivers, but also some additional ones that are more pertinent to us in the people space, such as how the world of work is changing, what the changing expectations might be of the current workforce and how those might be different to the expectations of the future workforce and how we need to respond. And that defence people's strategy really has 5 main components to it. So it concerns itself with what workforce do we think we will need in the future in terms of the composition, so what size and what mix. Secondly, it concerns itself with how do we maximise the talent of the workforce that we've got? How can we create a more integrated enterprise where the talent that we've got can move more freely across the enterprise, but also into and out of defence? How can we make defence maybe a little bit more porous? And using the critical common denominator for much of our work as the skills that people have and the ways that we need to unlock that. Thirdly, in terms of our strategy, we need to continue to look at what is the nature of the offer that we provide. Now, that's not only the remuneration side, it's everything else that goes with it, and how does that need to continue to evolve. Fourthly, there's an internal challenge that we've got, which is about creating an integrated people function within defence across all the single services and head office. And finally, as a bit of a golden thread running through all the strands, how can we become a more diverse and inclusive organisation? Next slide, please. So moving on to the what. So what is RF30? So, first thing to absolutely hammer home is that it was an independent review. And it was really tasked with answering this key question: if the world has changed in this way, what role can and should the reserves play in responding to those changes, and how? And it was absolutely a thorough report. It's been taking place, the review itself, for nearly a year, and it's reported directly to the Secretary of State for Defence. And as some of you may know, it was led by, to give him his full title, the Right Honourable Brigadier the Lord Lancaster, and it was in his role as a reservist that he was leading the review, supported by a small review team embedded within the MOD, working alongside reserves forces and cadets. And many of you will know that Mark Lancaster is formerly of this parish as a former Minister for the Armed Forces, and I think this really gave him a unique insight on the challenges that he wanted the review to address, and probably unique access to canvass views from a wide range of stakeholders, including most crucially reservists themselves, and as well many employers. Now, clearly he won't have been able to speak to everyone, but I know that he spoke to many people, and probably including representatives of some of the organisations that are here today. So in terms of publication of the independent review, I'm not in a position, unfortunately, today to be able to give you a date, but when exactly this will take place, and that's not because there is a date, but I have to withhold it. We just haven't finalised exactly what that date will be. But in terms of the sequencing, it will follow on pretty soon, I think, after the integrated review and the command paper that will be published later on this month. So finally, just important again to emphasise this point, it's an independent review at this stage, and the task that I will have as the SRO we're working through that report in detail and considering for each of the recommendations that it will contain within it, what our response will be. And that will then lead to the creation of an implementation programme, working very closely alongside reserves, forces and cadets. So Simon Brooks Ward's team here in Defence People. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is something a little bit about the who, and I'll halfway through this slide hand over to Hugh to run through some more material. So I think the first thing to say is that it's significant that the positioning of the implementation team is within Defence People. So I work to James Swift, who you heard from earlier on, as does Simon Brooks Ward. And it's true that many aspects of the recommendations will undoubtedly need to be carried out in conjunction with other areas of defence. But we think it's particularly important to house the implementation within the people function. So then a little bit more about who I am. So I've been a civil servant for over 25 years. I've worked in a variety of different departments and really formed a career most recently around areas of workforce reform across a number of different areas of government, including stints in the Cabinet Office, in the Treasury and in the Home Office. And in my time, I've led and been an SRO for some major projects in government. And I've been fortunate enough to go through the government's major projects leadership academy there. But I think probably most crucial as to why me is that my day job within the MOD is Director People Transformation, where really I have a portfolio director role where I'm responsible for cohering a large amount of work that will be complementary to and will need to be coherent and consistent with RF30 as we take it forward. So that will be in areas such as workforce planning, that will be in areas such as digital transformation of some of the tools that we're using within the people space, and about how we can put skills at the heart of how we organise ourselves for much of what we do. So there's a high degree, a high need for a high degree of synchronicity between RF30 and wider people transformation. So I'm obviously rapidly upskilling myself on more detail about the reserves. I've been fortunate enough to start with a history lesson, which I had very recently, going back to the 1800s, and I was talked through, the Haldane reforms of 1908, and some of the major conflicts of the 20th century and the role of reservists there. And I think it's important that I take the time to do that, to really understand more the role of reserves in terms of the fabric of the nation overall, to understand how we've ended up with the construct that we have today. And also what's come through already is that many of the questions of our age and the questions that the review team have set out are in some ways the same ones that have been asked for some time. So I think although our context is different and our answers will be different in terms of the context that we work within, many of the central questions are indeed the same ones that people have been grappling with for many decades. So anyway, I look forward to learning more and drawing on the professional reservist expertise we're fortunate enough to have access to in defence. And on that note, I will hand you over to Hugh to introduce himself and take us through the next few slides.
Thank you, Adrian. As mentioned, I'm a reservist through and through. I've been in the Army for 37 years, both as a soldier and as an officer, always a reservist. And during that time, I've served under many of the different conditions the terms and conditions that we can serve under. I've been a mobilised reservist. I worked full-time for some months whilst attending the Royal College of Defence Studies a few years ago. But the vast majority of that time has been as a part-time reservist, exactly as Shivali was talking about earlier, where I've had a full-time day job and had to do that juggling that she referred so eloquently to, ahead of mobilisation, that was. That full-time employment was mostly during those the last decades was for a large FTSE 100 chemical manufacturing company. ICI, for those of you in the audience who may remember us as a large corporation, now actually disappeared completely, never mind not in the FTSE 100. So very familiar with the dynamics, shall we say, working for a large organization. So what I bring to this is obviously that reserve foot in both camps, both military and civilian. Having worked for a large institution and being a member of the reserve for, as I say, 37 odd years now. That duration of service gives me the status as a subject matter expert in reserve service just by having done quite so much of it. So what I'm in the program to do is to provide Adrian with as much sort of practical advice on reserve service and what is the art of the possible and not possible sometimes, but also that historic context. There is clearly an historic and even more so an emotional context to uniform service. That isn't unique to the reserve at all. Everyone who wears a uniform has a vocational aspect to that service. And that is sometimes, we just need to be conscious of that all the time, that as well as the transactional employer-employee relationship for uniform service, there is a bit more emotion involved in that. And I'm delighted to be in this position to be able to be providing that support to Adrian as we progress the implementation program. I'd also just like to add at the end there that just in case you were wondering if Major General Simon Brooks Ward, who is well known to many in the audience, I'm sure, he is absolutely continuing to play a role in the report and in the implementation program as we go. So he will ensure continuity in all the good work that has gone hitherto in consulting many of you on this call. So with that, next slide, please. You'd be delighted to learn I'm not going to go through all these questions, but I just thought it would be worth putting them up to give an idea to this audience about what has been thought about and indeed what we are thinking about in terms of the Reserve Forces 30 report. It is pre-publication, as both Adrian and CDP have mentioned. So this gives that flavour and I would hope some reassurance about the areas that we are considering. It's to illustrate to you as our very much part of our key stakeholder group which way the thinking is going. I would like to unpack sort of 2 or 3 in there just to give you a flavour of the thinking, again, in a little bit more depth and some of the high level stuff that particularly CDP has mentioned. The first big idea I'd like to sort of share with you is that first one, the break glass versus whole force. Now, whole force is a phrase which you've heard a number of us mention throughout the morning so far. I will just first dwell briefly on the break glass, a break glass in emergency kind of idea. Many people, including my friends and family mostly, think of the reserve to some extent in that old Cold War context, admittedly that's a long time ago now, where we were there as an understood in time of emergency existential threat to the UK. And there is clearly still a huge element of our role which is under that. However, that break glass emergency thing from the good old bad old Cold War days has moved substantially. We're already, as you heard earlier from regarding the COVID response, a key source of essential source indeed of manpower, both in peace as being described and obviously that war role I've just mentioned. And the changing circumstances of the last 20 odd years, particularly the recent long campaigns in the desert, have meant it is time for us to start thinking again, to move away from the simple break glass concept that many hold and formalize that more sophisticated approach that we've been talking about with the whole force approach. Now, I hesitate to use an analogy because I'm not particularly good at sporting type things, but it has been put to me, this is very much like the use of reserve substitutes in football. 20, 30 years ago, a substitute was brought on when one of the players on the field was injured. Very much the idea of that emergency approach. These days, substitutes are played throughout the game to make sure you maximize the number of people available to you as the manager of the team, or indeed the captain. And also, people are put on for their specific skills at particular parts of the game. And I'm aware that some sports do that wholesale. I won't strain the analogy too much further, but you get the gist where we need to move from that substitution one for one when there's an absolute need to do it because something is broken, as opposed to a routine use of reservist substitutes, to use that analogy, for appropriate moments in the game. And I hesitate to use the word routine there because that obviously would not suggest that we're going to be doing this all the time, just as part of planning. And that's a good route into this idea of the whole force. Instead of considering us as regular and reserve, with some quite big gaps in the terms and conditions of service, but considering us as part-time and full-time. Many of you on the call will know that we have quite significant differences between a regular and reserve service, unlike many of you, where part-time and full-time workers are the same. Their only difference is the number of hours they do. Part of the challenges we will think about is how we might review that in terms of regular and reserve service models. This has to be in line with the individual, of course, and indeed you, the employers. And we'll keep returning to that. The need to keep absolutely in lockstep, to use an army phrase, with all of you is absolutely essential. The second area I'd like to raise, which has been so eloquently talked about this morning by our colleagues from HSBC, is support both to the reservist and to the employer. Now, support for both of us, both in that context, is both in steady state and when we're being used, when we're being mobilised for service, exactly as Shivali was talking about earlier on. Now, in the steady state, I was an employee, and my personal experience of reserve service during all those years, particularly within ICI, was nearly always positive. We were a very supportive employer, very much like the HSBC model that's being talked about earlier. Not universally, it was usually individual managers who didn't like it very much, but it was at worst tolerated, but mostly actively supported. I am very aware, however, that some of our service personnel experience open hostility from their employers, and indeed some keep their reserve service completely secret because they think it will be detrimental to their civilian jobs. That is something we need to do something about, and the cultural question is therefore raised. In use, as indeed Shivali was talking about, particularly when I was mobilised some decade ago, the support to us in use was, when we were mobilised for operations, was frankly magnificent, and it's good to hear that it still continues. But that needs to be kept under constant review, that the package we offer does match the need of the current workforce. Now, support to the employer when we're in use is when we're mobilised. I'm not an employer, I was an employee, and I know there are support packages but available for particularly for longer term mobilisations. But that is an area we need to have a look at, I'm sure, and that is an area where we will need to ask you for your advice and comments and indeed good ideas. In the steady state, I'll move on. In the steady state, as in terms of the day-to-day, how we support you during someone's, wrong, I shouldn't use the word support, how we provide incentives, for want of a better phrase, for you to employ reservists. And again, another open question. Now, the offer that we make is very well known, and Shivali articulated it very well, that the skills that she learns are brought back into the bank and vice versa. But there's nothing more we can do in that area, more to be thinking about. I would just say as an aside, as support to employees in the steady state, my 40-odd year career, next week, for the very first time in my career, one of my direct reports is going off to do her RAF reserve service for a week. So ask me at the end of the month how well I like having people plucked out of my team to go off and serve the state directly in uniform, in her case, she's a civil servant, for a week, and leave me to manage it. So I shall be eating the my own cake on that particular week. So ask me in a month's time how that went. Thirdly and lastly for this bit, terms of service. As we inevitably call it, terms and conditions of service, because I did mention earlier on, we have quite a different type of contract, actually called a commitment in defence rather than a contract, between regular and part-time service, regular and reserve service. And some of that design hasn't been changed for a while. You heard Adrian refer to the recent run through our history. Well, our minimum commitment, the famous 27 days, can actually be tracked directly back to a piece of legislation in 1852. And that legislation was specifically designed to ensure that reservists, particularly the militia and the yeomanry, were free to gather in the harvest. Particularly relevant to yeomen who had to bring their own horse, and that horse had to be available to the farmer to help gather in that the harvest. Some century, nearly 2 centuries ago. Now, a few things may have changed since then. I think it might be time to address some of the ideas that flow through our terms and conditions of service. I'm also very aware that when I joined in the 80s, the employment model then has changed dramatically. It was then, you're going to work for the same employer, more or less, for most of your career, more or less 9 to 5, acknowledging that some people work shift and at weekends. And the reserve employment model was very much designed to have a low impact on that. And most of the time, that worked pretty well. It is time for a rethink. Very aware that the modern employment practices are very different from that. Portfolio careers, much more flexibility in terms of work practices, and indeed the last year, if it has taught us anything, it's how flexible we really can be if put to it, with all of us sitting on this conference most of us sitting on this conference from our homes. So that particular area is one where we will be looking to you who've been operating all sorts of different flexible models to help us out with that and give us advice. So again, that stakeholder engagement with you as employers is something we very much look forward to. Next slide, please. Final slide for me before I hand back to Adrian. These questions on here are again there to give you a flavour of what we may be thinking about, and they are employer specific, obviously selected very much for this audience. I focused here obviously on the stakeholders, sorry, on you as a stakeholder, but I see this very much the thoughts of yours truly at the moment, but 3 really big groups of stakeholders. First is the reservist. Second, the employers, and actually lastly, and deliberately in this order, the MOD, because without those 3 being considered and in balance, the 3 legs on a stool, to use one of those famous type phrases, without those 3 legs being in balance and stable, the stool will be very rickety, or indeed if one is removed, will fall over. All 3 are needed for a stable system of reserve employment. Lots of ideas on that page, and lots of pretty big questions. But we're absolutely acknowledged this is a 2-way street with you, the employers. In fact, it's the 3-way street, as I mentioned, with the reservists as well. And if we are going to succeed in this, it must be a win-win-win for all 3 of us. The RF30 provides a catalyst for that creative thinking, and we will be wanting to very much wish to use the existing forums that we have to explore the ideas that you can offer us to help us out as we consider some quite knotty problems within this. And with that, and looking forward to future engagements with you in face-to-face, back to Adrian.
Thank you. Going to have the next slide, please. So look, I think in the interest of time, I'll rattle through this quite quickly, so to make sure we've still got the sufficient time for the panel discussion. So this is just, again, a few more brushstrokes. So emergent thinking at this stage, work in progress on, trying to think what good might look like over the next 5 to 10 years. And so the kinds of areas we're thinking about are, the concept of of an integrated workforce where the distinction is the commitment. So the physical commitment a reservist and their employer can provide. Where we've got whole force planning happening across that spectrum of conflict, from the kinetic through to the constant competition, referred to by CDS in here, the integrated operating concept, where we've got the right person, the right type of person with the right type of skills, with the right level of commitment matched to deliver the particular tasks that we're wanting to carry out. Hugh's spoken at length about the partnerships with employers, and the signal we want to give today is that we want to have those conversations with employers about how we can refresh and renew those partnerships, building on what's working well, and looking at the areas where we can evolve them further. You heard the Minister earlier in his piece of camera talking about us needing to end up in a place where we're able to tell you and your organisations what we might like to use, how often, in what circumstances, and at what notice. And so very up for conversations as to how to go about doing that. Availability for use. So again, that's really potentially looking at a less binary approach where we've got not being constrained by particular rules or constraints we might have imposed upon ourselves, but being driven by the capability that's required to deliver a particular military effect. And then finally, this more transparent understanding. So I think that works in two ways. So I think we would like to have a greater understanding of what we as Defence have got access to in terms of skills. So you as reservists are very, very unique, having your civilian skills alongside those you've developed in the military. How can we learn better what skills you've already got and what you've already done? And indeed, how can we then tell employers more about what people are gaining from their service in Defence? Final slide, please. So that's just then finishing with a quote. I think in the interest of time, I won't read it out. You're more than capable of doing so, reading it yourselves. And it's really just to give that signal that there is very high ministerial involvement and engagement and support for what RF30 is going to be achieving over the next few months and years ahead. And on that note, I will say thank you very much. I hope that's been of some use.